Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rochelle Diamond and Jamie Kerr.
I am in it to make a difference in people's lives. So I feel so grateful that through the speaker series, we can bring in enlightening and inspiring speakers who offer us their wisdom and their insights to make us more productive and successful. I'm Rochelle Diamond. I'm on our employee experience team here at LinkedIn, and I'm so excited to welcome you all today, whether you're in the room or on the stream. One of my favorite parts of the speaker series is how we're able to get so many amazing speakers to come to LinkedIn. We've had Andrea Iguodala, Arianna Huffington, Condoleezza Rice, Deepak Chopra. The list just goes on and on. And one of the ways that we're able to get these people, it's mainly through the connections and the relationships of our employees. It's just such a testament to our core value that relationships matter. And we have a great example of this today. Jamie Kerr is here to introduce our speaker because she was kind enough to make the introduction to her friend, Jennifer. So first of all, I'd like to give a big round of applause to Jamie, thanking her for making this event for us today possible. Round of applause. Yes, it means a lot. And now I will officially pass it over to you to introduce our guest for today.
Thank you, Rochelle. I am super excited to be here today to introduce my friend, Jennifer. Jennifer and I became friends through our sons, actually. So her youngest son and my only son are high schoolers who today are starting their sophomore year in high school. They're teenagers, but they have been teammates and they have been best friends since they were about 9 or 10 years old. And so, as you all know who are parents, when your kids become friends, you become friends. And in this case, that has turned out to be a wonderful experience, at least for me. I can't really speak for her. One of the things that our sons actually share in common is the experience of being young black boys and growing into young black men here in Silicon Valley. On the peninsula, where there are not a ton of people who look like them in their classrooms and teams. And so although Jennifer and I have shared tons of conversations about lots of different things over the years, some of the most meaningful conversations have been about the topic she's here today to speak about, which is bias and how it lives in our lives and in our schools and our workplaces and our communities and our country, and what we might be able to do about it. So we're so lucky to have her here. She is truly an expert on this subject. She has been researching the science of bias since before probably most of us in this room had ever heard the term unconscious bias. And she really looks at it through a lens that is both evidence-based and really thoughtful and really personal. So without further delay, I introduce a brilliant woman, a psychology professor at Stanford University, the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant Award, which is amazing, and the author of this really fantastic book, and my friend, Jennifer Eberhardt. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. During my short time here, I want to turn our attention to the wide-ranging effects of disparities and bias on our daily lives. Although we can have biases about groups based on all sorts of characteristics like gender and religion and class and so forth, I want to focus here on race. Now, the lay view on racial bias is that it is rare, that it's deliberate, that it's a moral failing. And these features of bias lead people to imagine bad actors inspired by hate. Yet these are not the only people who hold biases. In fact, my work is consistent with lots of other research on this topic, and it stands in stark contrast to this lay view on bias. And the basic ideas are that racial bias can influence us more than we think, that we can express bias unintentionally, even sort of despite our motivation and despite our desire to be fair. And most importantly, bias does not require bad actors. Instead, bias can be triggered by context. It can be triggered by the situations that we find ourselves in. So during my time here today, I want to demonstrate how racial disparities across a variety of contexts can inspire bias in many people, including us. And that bias can work to sustain and magnify disparities that are already there. Now, as an example, I'm going to speak about the black-white dynamic here quite a bit, where the research is most advanced, where the disparities are especially extreme, and where those extreme disparities seem to exist in almost every facet of life. So we're going to take a tour of empirical studies here, starting with those studies relevant to the criminal justice system. And let me start by saying that although African Americans make up under 13% of the US population, they make up nearly 40% of the prison population. And that disparity biases us. It can change how we see. And at the root of that process is this stereotypic association between blacks and crime. And with a number of colleagues, I've conducted numerous studies on this to demonstrate the power of that particular association. And we found that this black crime association is so strong that it can determine which objects we see in the world and which we don't. So black people are so associated with crime that the mere presence of a weapon can cause us, the mere presence of a black face can cause us to see a weapon better. So to examine this, we invited students into our laboratory. So this is an example of one of the studies that we've done. And we have them sit in front of a computer screen with the focus dot at the center. And then they see flashes of light around this focus dot. Now, these flashes are actually the faces of young men that they're being exposed to at such a rapid rate that they can't consciously detect them. So I want to show you the same thing here again in slow motion. And we call this a subliminal priming procedure. It's a standard procedure. And using this procedure, we expose some of our study participants to a whole series of black male faces, and then we expose others to a whole series of white male faces. And then after this procedure, we took those same participants and we asked them to perform a supposedly unrelated object recognition task. And for this task, they were presented with a series of objects on the computer screen, and each object started out really blurry, and it was brought into focus in 41 steps, or 41 frames. So it's getting clearer and clearer, and the participants' goal is to indicate the moment at which they can recognize what that object is. Some of these objects are crime relevant, like guns and knives. Some are crime irrelevant, like staplers and cameras and so forth. And we found that simply exposing people to black male faces beforehand led them to need a lot less information to detect those crime objects. They needed less clarity. They needed fewer frames before they could say, oh, that's a gun or that's a knife. So black faces facilitated the detection of these crime objects, whereas white faces inhibited their detection of those very same crime objects. So race biases what we see. And this particular study was conducted with both white and non-white study participants, and we found that the race of the participant didn't matter. You get the same pattern of results regardless of participant race. Now, on the next stop of the tour, we're going to take a look at how this black crime association can affect how we act, and in particular, our decision to shoot. So here, I want to talk about research that was conducted by Josh Carell and colleagues. Some years ago, they designed a shoot, don't shoot computer simulation. And in this computer simulation, participants saw on their computer screen a series of people, and each person was either holding a gun or holding a harmless object. And the participants were told, if you see someone holding a gun, push the button labeled shoot as quickly as you can. If you see someone holding a harmless object, push a button labeled don't shoot. Right? So I want to immerse you into this study. I want to give you a sense of what it's like to be a study participant in a psychological study. And so I have some of the slides that they used in this study with me, and I'm going to show you those slides. And if you see someone holding a gun, I want you to use your right hand to tap as quickly as you can for shoot. Okay, so right hand for shoot if you see a gun. If you see someone holding a harmless object, I want you to use your left hand to tap as quickly as possible for don't shoot. Okay, you got it? All right, so let's see how you do here. Okay, so first of all, the object of this is to act quickly, right? That's the whole point, right? So you want to move fast, make your decision quickly, right? And then also tap louder so we can kind of hear what's happening in the room, okay? All right, so I have a number of these slides, so they're practice effects. So I'm hoping you'll get better here. All right, let's try it again. Okay, that's much better. Okay, all right, so the researchers asked study participants to do this about 80 times, and they found that on average, people were faster to shoot a black person with a gun than a white person with a gun. So that's one race effect they saw. They also found that people were more likely to mistakenly shoot a black person who held no gun than a white person who held no gun. So they got this, race effect, right, both in terms of the speed to respond, but also in terms of the actual decision that people made. And these effects have been replicated now by different teams of researchers in different parts of the country. And not only do they find these results with college students, but they find the same pattern of results with community members. And in fact, the same results emerge even with black community members. So again, the race of the participant doesn't seem to make a difference. Now, the shoot, don't shoot simulation contains these still images of people who were posed in different positions. Yet this Black Crime Association can also influence how we interpret body motion. And how we perceive body motion also matters in the context of crime. Police officers base their suspicions of criminal wrongdoing in part on body motion. So at the next stop of the tour here, I want to present a study designed to answer a simple question, and that is, how does race influence how officers read body motion? So this time, we conducted an archival study that involved data that was collected by the NYPD on their stop, question, and frisk practices. And each time an officer stops someone on the streets of New York City, they're required to complete a form with all kinds of information about the stop. And on that form, they're required to indicate why it was they made the stop. So there are lots of legitimate reasons to make a stop, including what they call furtive movement. And so our question here was, how is race related to perceptions of furtive movement, right? So what is furtive movement, you might wonder? So it turns out the department didn't know. Like there was no agreed upon definition of what furtive movement was. And so that left it to officers to determine for themselves what movement is suspicious and what movement isn't suspicious. And different officers can make that determination using different criteria. The same officer can make that determination differently depending on what location they are in the city, right? And so, you know, this can kind of move around quite a bit. It's subjective, right? So we're interested in how race influences those interpretations. And so in 2010, during the peak of stop and frisk in New York, officers made over 600,000 stops. And we found that over 300,000 of those stops were based on furtive movement. So to a big extent, officers are using body movement as a cue to threat and danger and criminal activity. And when we just focused on white and black community members who were stopped for furtive movement during the peak of stop and frisk, we found that 88% of them were black and 12% were white. And then next we looked at racial disparities in treatment after being stopped for furtive movement. And we found that black people were more likely to be frisked and they were more likely to be subjected to physical force, even though they were no more likely to have a weapon. And in fact, only 1% of those stopped for furtive movement actually had a weapon. Now, despite all of this, most New Yorkers at the time supported aggressive stop and frisk practices. So why is this? So we did some follow-up studies to look at this, and we found that the more people were reminded of the racial disparities in the criminal justice system, so for example, the more black they thought the prison population was, the more they thought that these aggressive practices were necessary to keep order and to stay safe. So I want to pause here for a moment before moving to the next stop on the tour, and I want to tell you a story. Some years ago, I was on a plane with my son. This is a different son. I have 3 sons, actually, and so this is a different son from the son that Jamie told you about. And this story takes place some time ago when he was just 5 years old. And so he's 5, right? And he's on this plane with mommy. He's so excited, about being on this plane. And he's like looking all around and checking people out. And he sees this black man on the plane. And he says, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the guy, and he doesn't look anything at all. I mean, nothing at all like Daddy. And I'm like looking. And so I started looking around, and I realized he was the only black guy on the plane. And I thought, okay, I'm going to have a talk with my son about how not all black people look alike, right? So I'm thinking, okay, well, how do I have this talk with the 5-year-old? I'm trying to, get the language together, get ready for the lecture, right? And before I started, having the talk, I realized that, children see the world in a way different from adults, right? They haven't been conditioned year after year to see people in certain ways. And so I thought, well, maybe there's some resemblance there that I'm not seeing. Right? So I decide to give it a shot, and I look at this guy, and I'm looking for any resemblance, right? And so I look at him, I look at his height, and nothing there, right? He was about 4 inches shorter than my husband. And then I look at his weight, nothing there. I look at his facial features, no resemblance there. I look at his skin color, nothing there. I look at his hair, and this guy has these long dreadlocks flowing down his back. And my husband shaves his head. So I thought, all right, you're going to get the talk, right? So I turned to my son, and I'm like, okay, I'm ready to give him the talk. But before I could say anything, he looks up at me, and he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "What? What did you say?" And he says it again. He says, "Well, I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, Daddy wouldn't rob a plane. And he said, yeah, I know. I said, well, why would you say that? And he looked at me with this really sad face. And he says, I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that. We're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next. Even with no malice, no hatred, this Black Crime Association made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old. And it makes its way into the minds of all of our children and to all of us. My son lives in California, right? He lives, I want to get those slides back on somehow. Hey, somebody back there? Okay, thank you. He lives in a state, right, where less than 6% of the population is black. Yet nearly 30% of those incarcerated are black. And those disparities have broad reach. They affect not only how we see black men, they affect how we see their children. Even 5-year-olds are caught in the grip. In a recent study by Andrew Todd and colleagues, they found that people associate the faces of black kindergartners with crime. In a laboratory study, they asked people to look at a computer screen and to categorize the objects they saw as either guns or toys, and to do this as quickly as possible. Now, they also saw children's faces, which they were told to ignore. So I'm going to give you a little demo here of what people saw. So they had to say gun or toy, gun or toy, gun or toy, gun or toy. And they found that mere exposure to black children's faces led them to identify the guns more quickly. So bias can move from the prisons to the streets. It can seep into our schools, and it can shadow our children as they learn. So the next stop on the tour is the schoolhouse. Hey, somebody? Okay. Okay, so here I want to focus on the role of racial bias and how teachers discipline their students. So there are racial disparities in the schooling context as well. So in the US, African American students are more than 3 times as likely to be suspended or expelled than white students. And close to 70% of those students who are pushed out of school end up at some point in their lifetimes in the criminal justice system. Now, minor infractions are a big reason why teachers discipline students. But how do we know what's driving these kinds of disparities, right? To what extent is it teacher bias, right? Teacher racial bias? And to what extent is it the possibility that black children just misbehave more so than other children? And so we conducted a study to try to get at this, right? We wanted to understand the causal role of racial bias in all of this. And so we conducted an online study with practicing teachers in different regions of the country. And we asked them to simply imagine teaching at this middle school. We then asked them to read the office referral record of a student who had misbehaved in some benign way. So for example, they read about a student who was disrupting class by getting up and getting tissues out of a tissue box and so forth. And for half of our teachers, they read about Greg, a student with a stereotypically white name who misbehaved in this way. And for the remaining teachers, they read about Darnell, a student with a stereotypically black name who misbehaved in the identical way, right? So this change in names was our race manipulation, and we found that initially the race of the student didn't influence how teachers viewed the infraction. But they read later that the student had misbehaved again. So this time they read that Greg was sleeping in class and you tell him to wake up and do work, and he's continuing to sleep. Or they read that Darnell misbehaved in this way. And here we see huge race effects. The teachers see Darnell's behavior as more problematic, as more disruptive than Greg's behavior. They feel more irritated with Darnell, and they want to discipline him more. And not only do they want to discipline him more in the moment, they also can more easily imagine disciplining him down the road. They can more easily imagine suspending him down the road, right? So think about that, going from getting tissues out of a tissue box or sleeping in class, and already what comes online for the teachers is that they can they want to discipline you, and not only in that moment, but they can imagine you being a problematic student later. So why is this? So we did follow-up studies on this, and we found that when it came to Greg, teachers saw the two infractions as isolated incidents. So one had nothing to do with the other. But when it came to Darnell, they saw the incidents as related, right? They saw them as indicative of a pattern of misbehavior that had to be shut down. And so that's why we get the difference in how much they wanted to discipline them. And so after just 2 strikes, just 2 misbehaviors, 2 incidents, right, they saw Darnell as a troublemaker. And this starts early, right? So for example, when researchers at Yale told preschool teachers to watch for children who might cause trouble, they looked at the black children, right? So they showed them an image, actually a video of children who were playing at a table, and none of the children actually misbehaved. They were told to just watch for someone who might misbehave, and they found, using eye tracking equipment, that those preschool teachers looked more at the black students, and they looked at the black boy in particular. So this starts early, and it follows them as they grow into adults and later join the workforce. So for the final stop on our tour, I want to take a peek at the workplace. In a now a classic study, 2 economists, Bertrand and Mullin-Nathan, examined the role of race in hiring decisions. And they were looking here at the U.S. labor market, and they were looking at sort of the low-wage labor market. So they were looking at office clerks and people with various retail sales positions and so forth. And they developed 5,000 resumes. And they systematically varied the race of the applicant, and they sent those resumes out to employers in Chicago and in Boston. And they found that those resumes with black-sounding names generated only way fewer callbacks than those with white-sounding names. So those with black-sounding names, those resumes received 50% fewer callbacks from potential employers. And this particular study was conducted back in 2004. Yet these results have held up over time in a recent meta-analysis. So this was an analysis that examined these audit studies like these conducted over the past 25 years. And they found that African Americans and Latinos continue to receive fewer callbacks. And these results are not limited to the US. Researchers have found the same effects with all kinds of disfavored groups in Australia and in Canada and across Europe. Even students from elite colleges are concerned about bias in the labor market. So researchers have shown that they attempt to take action to shield themselves from bias. So, for example, in a series of studies led by Sonia Kong and colleagues, they found that Black and Asian American students attempt to whiten their resumes to appear more acceptable to employers. So Jamal Anthony Smith becomes J. Anthony Smith. Chinese American students will use their American sounding nicknames on their resumes rather than their Chinese birth names. And the researchers found that their concerns are warranted. Actually, whitened resumes do indeed receive more callbacks from potential employers than unwhitened resumes. And this is the case even for employers who state that they care about diversity and inclusion. So bias and concerns about bias are issues even in the investment industry, right, where the financial stakes are incredibly high. And with a private investment firm, we've begun to look at this. We've begun to look at the causal role that race can play in investment decisions. And so to examine this, our study participants were asset allocators, so we went right to the people who determine what businesses to invest in, and we presented these asset allocators with one-page descriptions of highly qualified venture capital teams. We used the photographs of the managing partner of each team to manipulate the race of that person. So either that managing partner was black or that managing partner was white. And we found that these asset allocators evaluated the highly qualified black-led teams more negatively in terms of their track record, in terms of their expertise, in terms of their ability to execute on strategy. So all of these critical dimensions, right? Even though their qualifications were identical to the white-led teams. So the lack of diversity in the investment industry may not only be a pipeline problem. It's not just that it's harder to find highly qualified black-led venture capital teams. When they're out there, when they show up, we're finding that access is more likely to be denied. In fact, we're finding that the more qualified these black-led teams are, the more bias they face. Now, when we look at who is in the investment industry, the racial and gender disparities are about as extreme as you can get, right? And the question is, how do these disparities feed bias? How might these disparities influence how people are evaluating pitches? Who is too risky? Who is worthy of investment? So in this space too, we're finding that the disparity that exists in the sector itself can be self-perpetuating. So what do? Okay. When bias, is all around us, it's in our workplaces, it's in our schools, it's in our police departments. From birth until death, there is this bias there that can find its way to us and that can move through us. And so I want to argue here that although racial bias is something that can touch our lives in all these different ways, in all these different sectors, right, we're not doomed to be under its grip. We're all vulnerable to bias, but we're not acting on bias all the time. Bias is something that's triggered by the situations we find ourselves in. And as researchers, we know a lot about what those triggers are. So for example, lack of time is a trigger. When you're forced to make a decision really quickly and you don't have time to really think things through, it forces us to rely on these well-practiced associations, these automatic associations, and those associations then can infect our decision-making and infect our actions. So you remember when we did the shoot, don't shoot simulation, right? And I was pushing you to go quickly. I was pushing you to go quickly because that's where you see a bias come out, right? It's when you're forced to move fast. If you can relax and kind of take your time, there's no evidence that there's any distinction between how someone will view a black person with a gun versus a white person with a gun. It's when you're forced to move fast. Subjective standards, that's another situation where bias can come alive. And I talked about the NYPD, right, and their furtive movements. This is a subjective standard that they were using to evaluate others and to determine whether they were up to no good, whether they were going to engage in criminal activity and so forth, whether they were suspicious. But if you have a standard like that that's so ambiguous, it's one of those things that can lead to bias. And what they found and what we found from analyzing that data is it's an area where you find the most, the strongest racial disparities, actually. And they've removed that this subjective standard, which is furtive movements, from the form that police officers use now. So they can no longer stop someone simply on the basis of that. So lack of accountability is another trigger, and lack of training, lack of positive contact. Even the emotional states that we're in can influence whether we are more likely to act on bias or not. And the cultural norms in this space can also influence bias. It can trigger bias, or it can keep it at bay. So we know a lot about this, about the sort of conditional nature of bias, and with that knowledge comes power, right? Because once we're aware of those triggers, we can do something about it, right? We can actually adjust our environment so that we're less likely to act on it. Now, the triggers that I'm showing you here are at work regardless of the group that's targeted by bias. I've talked a lot about race and about African Americans and white Americans in particular, but this is something beyond black and white, and these triggers are at work regardless of the group that is targeted, and they are at work within us as individuals as well as within the systems that we build. So I want to give you an example of this, and most people, I believe, in this room are familiar with Nextdoor, the tech company right up the road in San Francisco, and their whole purpose is to create stronger and healthier and safer neighborhoods by, creating this online space where people can gather and they can share information and so forth, right? And so that's why they exist. And but they discovered that they had a problem with racial profiling on the platform. So people would look out the window and see a black man. It typically was, an African-American male and in an otherwise white neighborhood, and they would see that person as suspicious. And so they would start contacting the neighbors. They might even contact the police. And they would do this even when that person wasn't engaging in any criminal activity or criminal wrongdoing at all. So the co-founder was worried about this, Sarah Leary, and she reached out to me and reached out to others to figure out what to do. And they also, the folks at Nextdoor began to consult the literature on bias and found that, when you're acting quickly, when you're in a heightened state, right, you're more likely to act on bias. And so they realized that to curb profiling on the platform, that they were going to have to slow people down, right? But this actually produced a little bit of tension there, right? Because they're a tech company. You're not supposed to slow people down, right? Your whole idea is to remove friction, right? You're trying to produce these products where they're easy to use, where you can use them quickly, where you can use them without thinking. But the problem is those are the conditions under which bias is most likely to come alive. So they had to make a choice, right, between slowing people down and potentially losing, people dropping off of the platform, or not addressing the problem. And so they decided to address it. And I think, a lot of that had to do with just not only what their core values were, but just why the platform exists in the first place, right? It's to bring community members together, not to make them tear them apart. And so they decided to slow people down, and they did this by simply adding a checklist. So now when you see somebody suspicious and you go to the crime and safety tab, you can't just report out to all your neighbors, suspicious person. You have to look at this checklist. And there are 3 items on the checklist. And the first one is, what is it about the person's behavior that is suspicious? So it can't be suspicious black man. It can't be a social category, right? It has to be a behavior. And then the second item on there is for them to describe the person. And you have to describe the person's individual features rather than their social category. So again, it's kind of reorienting people. And then the third item on that checklist has to do with a definition of racial profiling. They provide that definition for people because oftentimes people didn't know what racial profiling was or that they were engaging in it, right? And so they gave them a definition, and then they said that this is prohibited on the platform. So that's setting the cultural norm that we talked about, sort of what's permissible, what is, what is expected, and so forth. And so you all are familiar with seeing these signs in the airport, right? If you see something, say something. So they modified this so that if you see something suspicious, say something specific. So that's what they were going for. And just using this technique of just slowing people down, they were able to curb racial profiling on their platform by over 75%. So a huge drop there in profiling. Now, people will often say to me that, you can't expect this to work in all situations, and sometimes people just have to, move quickly and make decisions fast, and you couldn't expect this to work, for example, with police officers when you have to make split-second decisions. But it turns out that you can. Actually, working with the Oakland Police Department, I and a number of my colleagues were able to help the department to reduce the number of stops they made of people who were not committing any serious crimes. And we did this by forcing officers to simply ask themselves a question each and every time before they made a stop. And that question was, is this stop intelligence-led, yes or no? And by intelligence-led, we mean, do I have credible evidence to tie this particular person to a specific crime? So they ask themselves that question each time before they make a stop, right? And so it's getting them to, again, slow down, right, to pause, to think about, why am I considering pulling this person over? It's pushing them to use evidence of wrongdoing in place of intuition. And we found that using this technique, so in 2017, officers made about 32,000 stops. So these are just the reasons that something can be intel-led, which I'll skip for now. So in 2017, officers made about 32,000 stops. But in 2018, with the addition of this checkbox, they made just under 20,000 stops. And the African-American stops alone fell by 43%, right? And this drop happened even as the crime rate continued to fall. So real change is possible in policing, and real change is possible in many settings. And sometimes the route to that change is going to be hard, and it's going to be complicated, it's going to be expensive. But sometimes the change can be produced by simply checking a box. And I want to just end with a few words about why I wrote this book. And I want to just highlight a quote that actually starts the book. And this is a quote by James Baldwin. And he says here, "A journey is called that because you cannot know what you will do with what you find, or what you find will do to you." And so in this book, I attempt to take everyday people on a journey, and I take them through the scientific enterprise, as I took you through that enterprise briefly today. And I also take them to places so that they can see how issues of race can show up in police departments and in courtrooms and in neighborhoods and in schools and workplaces and so forth. And everywhere they go, readers, they not only discover scientific ideas about how the human mind works and how we interact and what it all means. They're meeting people. They meet people who are struggling and fighting. And they meet people like Tiffany Crutcher, whose twin brother was shot and killed by a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma several years ago. And she responded to that pain by dedicating her life to police-community relations, to improving those relations. They meet Bernice Donald, who was one of a handful of black students to desegregate an all-white high school in Olive Branch, Mississippi in the 1950s. And they meet women and people of color in workplaces all over the world who are trying to gain entry and trying to make headway and trying to be seen. And not only do the readers meet people, but I met people, right, during this process. I was searching for information as I met people, but during those meetings was just really hit with, their emotion and their sort of raw pain. And I became just more appreciative of the power of science to soothe, as well as to explain. As humans, we're meaning seekers, and we, trying to find answers. We want to understand why. In the process of writing this book, it just changed me, because I recognized that science can actually play a role in sort of improving people's lives on not just a knowledge level, but also just in terms of providing comfort to people. So the journey changed me, and I'm hopeful that this book can begin to change the conversations that we're having about race in this country right now, and to sort of change conversations that we're having right now about inequality in general. So with that, I think I'm a little behind time here, so I'm going to stop and take questions. So thank you. So.
Awesome. If you all have questions, you can line up at the mic. I have several that have come in from the stream, so
good.
I'd like to start with some of those. So the first one is, how do we protect Black children from internalizing negative racial bias? And are there tools for parents to help navigate bias in their children's classroom?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about bias to our children early, to talk about race early. Oftentimes, we think as parents we want to protect our children, and we want to protect their innocence, and we don't want to put too much on them. But oftentimes, not talking about these issues, it kind of leaves our children on their own to figure things out for themselves. And so when things are happening to them, they need help in sorting through that. They need help in thinking about that. And so I don't feel like we do them a service to wait to have the conversations. Also, sometimes people think that the way to do this is to never have that conversation, right? Just to be colorblind. And this colorblind strategy is the way that we're going to achieve racial equality, but the research doesn't bear that out. Actually, being colorblind actually leads people to not only be blind to color, but also be blind to discrimination that's happening right in front of them. And so that would be my advice, is to talk about it early. I think when we don't talk about these issues, it's a lot more difficult to talk about them later as adults, and we're kind of struggling now, I feel like, to have conversations in this country about race, because for so long, so often, we're told to ignore what's happening.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for coming, Dr. Eberhardt. My question is, my suspicion is that if when you just see an appearance of someone that you don't know, it's easy to form a judgment of them. But once you get to know that person, you learn a lot more, and you have to drop your judgments and so forth. So, as a scientist, have you ever studied whether that factor, the familiarity with African Americans or whoever, Latinos, whether that influences, your reaction, like your bias?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually a lot of research on this. So there's studies that look at just receiving what they call individuating information on people, and how that helps you sometimes to replace these sort of broad stereotypes with actual, real sort of concrete information about the person, so that they become an individual, not just a representative of their category. But that's not the only answer, right? Because even that, there could be problems there, especially when people come into contact contact, and they're coming into contact in unequal situations. I think for a long time people thought, well, let's just bring people together and let's just have them get to know one another and all these biases will go away. But it turns out that the nature of the contact matters quite a bit. So if the contact is where you're bringing groups together and they're unequal, if the contact is such where you're bringing people together and that is not something that is supported by the leaders, in that environment, if you're bringing people together and they're not actually forming sort of real sort of connected relationships, the relationships are more superficial, if they're in competition with one another. So there are all these ways in which you can bring people into contact that actually won't help the bias and actually could exacerbate it even. So it's not just bringing people together, but it's how you bring them together that matters.
It's the context.
Yeah, exactly.
So for example, I think I've heard this, like police have organized like pickup basketball games and brought, kids and neighborhoods together, and that seems like that could help.
Yeah, so that's why they do that, right? So that they don't have these associations that are all negative with the people that they are serving and policing and so forth. You want to have positive contact, not just negative contact. That is the theory behind it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eberhardt. My name is Krishna. I would like to ask a question based on something I'm studying. It's I call credibility score. It's kind of like credit score, but for humans, it's about credibility. So your credibility, or anyone's credibility, is based on two aspects: your incompetence and your dishonesty. So anything I don't know anything about, I've never heard about it, I'm incompetent. I can increase or decrease my degree of incompetence by knowledge. The dishonesty, on the other hand, is really either explicit or implicit. And you talked a lot about the implicit side of it today. So a lot of problems we see are a factor of a combination of both, right? You can increase someone's incompetence or decrease the incompetence to a point where like they know a lot about it, but still, if they're just fundamentally dishonest about dealing with it, how do you cope with that? Do you have some thoughts in your studies? Have you looked at separating things by that?
Well, there's some research looking at the nature of stereotyping, and there are kind of two dimensions that they've outlined. One has to do with competence, and the other has to do with likability. And so, to the extent that honesty or dishonesty is about sort of how much you like the person, not just sort of what their skill set is. So that work I think is relevant there, and they find that certain social groups are are high in terms of competence and likability. Some are low on competence and likability, and that actually affects not only the stereotypes that we have about them, but then also how we behave towards them. Some of the most disturbing research that I've come across was research looking at, how people perceive others who are homeless. And so this was a neuroimaging study where they would show people images of people, like just all kinds of people. And they find normally when you show an image of a person in the scanner, there's an area of your brain that gets excited, it gets activated, called the left medial prefrontal cortex. And so, when you just see another person, right? But when you're looking at someone who was homeless, that area just goes dim. There's not the activation there, and so it's almost as though that person isn't even being registered, as human, simply because they are homeless. And those researchers looked at this sort of warmth competence kind of dimensions to explain that. So they're called people who are seen as incompetent and are seen sort of negatively like that, are considered kind of the lowest of the low, and they were able to look at our response to them. It's almost like a lack of a response rather than a response. And so yeah, I think that you're onto something, and those are fundamental dimensions that people use to try to understand human interactions and human behavior and so forth. So
Thank you.
thanks.
Thank
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for writing the book and instigating an important conversation. I think your last response is really interesting in the context of what the Bay Area is doing for housing homeless folks and the pushback against that.
Yeah.
My question is maybe like on part of a vein of what your book is about, but it's more in the context of the workplace. I'm curious how we might make others aware that they're exhibiting biased behavior when maybe they don't want to hear that, because I think it can trigger a defensive response. But if it's triggered by situations, how do we combat those circumstances in the workplace? Because lack of time, mental fatigue, those types of things are pervasive at work. And even though we don't have these split-second decisions like shoot or don't shoot in the workplace, managers do have to make decision after decision after decision in an 8-hour day. And it's with a finite amount of brain power.
Right.
So I'm wondering how companies can work to remove the triggers against maybe racial bias coupled with age bias and gender bias, and normalize between existing employees and candidates that, like, in the Jamal example.
Right.
How can you kind of remove some of those issues? And the thought that I have on this is the reality is that the bias will continue to operate every day, and the decisions will every day impact the people that conversation or decision is about until there's a systemic change. So how do either we as employees or the companies start to work against that?
That's great. I love that question. It's a big question.
Sorry.
Series of questions, I would say. But I just want to put those triggers up on the screen again so that people can look at them. There's a lot to unpack there, right? I do feel like we have more room, more decisions that we can make than we realize sometimes. Like I said, and that was why I showed the example of the Oakland Police Department with the addition of this checkbox, because that is kind of the penultimate, situation where people say, oh, well, there's no time, right? But there are things that you can do to build in that time, or just to change the person's mindset before they make a decision, and to do that at critical decision points. And so I think that's important. And I think there's all this that we have at our disposal to figure out sort of creative ways to do that. All of this that's on the screen, though, this is all about once an association is there, how it gets triggered, and how to make sure that that association doesn't influence how we treat the person. But the idea of how the association got built in the first place, I think that is what you're asking too, and that I think is a lot harder. It's not just the sort of the momentary thing, right? It's a longer term effort, and I think for that to I feel like a lot of those associations are built in the way that they are because of the disparities that people see out in society, out in the world, and not just the fact of the disparities, but how they interpret those disparities. So, for example, I talked a lot about that Black Crime Association. Some of that is due to the disparities, right? And who's in prison, disparities in the actual crime rate, and so forth. But if people interpret that disparity as something that's just inherently something that's wrong with that group, where they're inherently criminal, you get one set of solutions and one set of policies, and your reaction to that is one thing. But if you interpret those disparities as in part a function of policy, as a function of history, as a function of sort of daily practices and so forth, then you get a whole another set of options that are available to you to intervene in some way. So that is really important, I think. To look at the disparities that are feeding the bias, but also the narratives that we have about those disparities that are feeding that bias. And that takes longer term work. I mean, it takes work to, like in the workplace, for example, to think about even people's mindsets around diversity, right? Oftentimes, people feel like, well, diversity means that you're going to lower standards, that, things aren't going to be as good, or people are going to come in who aren't deserving, like all kinds of notions of that. But if you actually look at the research on diverse groups, we find that those groups are actually they're better functioning groups in terms of, the problems they can solve, or in terms of their creativity, and in terms of, there are lots of dimensions where we know about this, right? But if you have one idea of or mindset or narrative about who people are that isn't addressed at all, you'll continue to have issues, and you'll have to deal with those issues only with what's up there on the screen, by trying to make sure the association doesn't affect us, but not undoing that association in some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I will think about that for all.
Okay. you ask a big question and you get a big answer. So I don't know. Oh, is it time? I guess it's time, as Rochelle's coming back. So
I wish I feel like we could talk for hours with you. I wanted to thank you so much for coming and spending your time with us. You've definitely given us a lot to think about. And during the event, I've gotten pinged by so many people in the company. Is there an extra book? Is there an extra book? I need a book. I want to read this. So you definitely got a lot of interest. So
good.
Thank you so much. If you are in the room, she will be sticking around to sign books. And if you joined us on the stream, thank you so much for joining. So let's give a final big round of applause to Jennifer. And we'll see you at the next speaker series.
Thank you. Thank you.